Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The intelligence preparation for Operation Overlord represents the pinnacle of multidisciplinary scientific warfare, where the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history rested not just on the courage of soldiers but on the meticulous, invisible calculations of geologists, oceanographers, and mathematicians. The fundamental question facing the Allied High Command was deceptively simple but lethally complex. Could the beaches of Normandy support the weight of the heavy armor required to break the Atlantic Wall? To answer this, analysts had to pioneer techniques in remote sensing and clandestine reconnaissance that had never been attempted. The disaster at Dieppe in 1942 had provided a bloody lesson. There, the Churchill tanks had been immobilized by the church shingle of the beach, turning them into sitting ducks for German anti-tank guns. The lesson was clear: if the ground failed, the mission failed. Thus began a 2-year odyssey of data collection that turned the French coastline into a known laboratory. The center of this scientific storm was the Inter-Services Topographical Department, or ISTD, which worked in tandem with the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, known as COP. These organizations were tasked with mapping every square inch of the landing zones without alerting the German defenders. The first layer of their analysis was archival and crowdsourced. In a stroke of genius, the British government launched an appeal through the BBC for civilians to send in their pre-war holiday photographs and postcards of the French coast. While the public believed this was for general geographic familiarity, for the analysts, these photos were data points for early photogrammetry. By examining the grain of the sand in a family snapshot or the way a person's foot sank into the beach in a 1938 holiday photo, analysts could begin to categorize the texture and slope of specific sectors. They looked for the angle of repose of the dunes and the presence of rock outcrops that indicated the underlying geological structure. Beyond postcards, the Royal Air Force's photographic reconnaissance units performed thousands of sorties over the Calvados coast. These flights were not merely looking for gun emplacements, they were measuring the physics of the ocean. Using a technique refined by Brigadier Ralph Bagnold, a man who had spent the pre-war years studying the movement of sand in the Egyptian desert, analysts studied wave refraction. As waves move from deep water into the shallows, they change speed and direction based on the contours of the seabed. By measuring the wavelength and the speed of the wave crests through sequential photographs taken seconds apart, analysts could calculate the underwater gradient. They could tell where the water would be shallow enough for a landing craft to ground and, more importantly, whether the beach surface at that point was composed of firm sand or treacherous silt. A sudden change in wave velocity often signaled a runnel, a deep trough in the sand that could swallow a tank whole. The most terrifying variable was the peat problem. Professor J.D. Bernal, a key scientific advisor to Mountbatten and Eisenhower, suspected that parts of the Normandy coast were built upon ancient, submerged forests and marshes from the Quaternary period. If a layer of sand was only a few inches thick, resting on a bed of soft, organic peat or blue clay, a 30-ton Sherman tank would perform what engineers called a punch-through failure. The sand would appear firm to the eye, but the concentrated pressure of the tank's tracks would cause the underlying peat to liquefy, creating a vacuum that would trap the vehicle. To solve this, the Allies could not rely on photos alone. They needed physical samples. This led to the formation of the COP units, divers and engineers who would be deployed from midget submarines like the X-Craft to swim to the shore under the cover of darkness. These combat geologists were equipped with specially designed augers and pentrometers. An auger was essentially a hollow tube that could be driven into the sand to extract a vertical core sample. A pentrometer measured the resistance of the soil as it was pushed down, providing a direct measurement of the bearing capacity. During missions like Operation Postage Able, these men worked within yards of German sentries, silently collecting tubes of sand and mud. Upon their return to England, these samples were rushed to laboratories where they were subjected to intense scrutiny. Geologists performed sieve analyses to determine the grain size distribution. They discovered that well-graded sand with a variety of grain sizes, locked together more effectively than uniform sand, providing higher shear strength. They also looked for shell hash, broken fragments of mollusks that could act as tiny sliding planes, reducing the friction between sand grains and making the beach unstable. The analysis went even deeper into the realm of micropaleontology. By examining the microscopic fossils and foraminifera within the stolen sand samples, scientists could identify the exact geological era of the sediment. If the fossils were from a brackish water environment, it confirmed the existence of a buried lagoon, signaling a high risk of peat. This biological fingerprinting allowed the ISTD to create trafficability maps. These maps were color-coded: green for firm sand, amber for caution, and red for areas where only infantry could pass. The precision was so high that they could predict rut depth, how many inches a tank's track would sink at a specific tide level. They had to account for poor water pressure, the way water trapped between sand grains would push back against the weight of a vehicle. If the water couldn't drain away fast enough as a tank drove over it, the sand would lose all internal friction, a phenomenon known as liquefaction. To validate their theories, the Allies used the Great Brass Brain, a massive mechanical analog computer at the Liverpool Tidal Institute. This machine predicted the tides for June 1944 with incredible accuracy. The analysts realized that the beach's strength changed with the tide. As the tide recedes, the water table inside the beach drops slower than the ocean level. This creates a seepage force that actually increases the effective stress of the sand, making it firmer. Therefore, the load-bearing capacity was at its peak shortly after the tide had gone out. The timing of the invasion was thus a compromise between the depth of water needed to clear German obstacles and the time needed for the sand to drain enough to support the armor. The engineers did not just accept the geological risks, they designed solutions for them. This was the origin of Hobart's Funnies, the specialized tanks of the 79th Armored Division. For the red zones identified on the maps, they created the Churchill Bobbin. This tank carried a massive roll of reinforced canvas and Hessian matting that it would unroll in front of itself, creating a temporary road over the soft peat and clay. Without the invisible calculations of the analysts, these tanks would not have been built, and the British and Canadian armor at Gold and Juno beaches would likely have been bogged down in the surf. At Omaha Beach, the analysis was even more critical because the beach was perched over an old marsh. The analysts warned that the exits from the beach were the only stable paths. If the American tanks strayed from the shingle banks, they would be lost. The synthesis of this data was a monumental task of intelligence fusion. It combined the wave mathematics of Ralph Bagnold, the geological theories of Carl Terzaghi, the mechanical computations of the Tidal Institute, and the harrowing field reports of the COP divers. They even used acoustic sounding from the air, dropping small explosives and timing the echoes to determine the density of the seabed. This multi-layered approach ensured that when the ramps dropped on June 6, 1944, the Allied commanders knew more about the ground they were stepping on than the German defenders who had occupied it for 4 years. The success of the landings was a testament to the fact that modern warfare had become a science of the environment. The analysts had successfully weighed the Earth itself, ensuring that the foundation of the liberation of Europe was as solid as the math they used to measure it. As the invasion progressed, the data also informed the construction of the Mulberry harbors. These artificial ports required an understanding of the seabed's shear strength to prevent the massive concrete caissons from shifting in the summer gales. Every grain of sand, every microscopic shell, and every wave crest had been turned into a piece of a giant mathematical puzzle. This clandestine geological survey remains one of the most significant yet under-celebrated achievements of the war. It proved that in an age of industrial slaughter, the most powerful weapon was often a slide rule and a core sample. The legacy of these analysts lives on in modern geotechnical engineering, but its most profound impact was felt on the shores of Normandy, where the ground held firm, the tanks rolled forward, and the Atlantic Wall finally crumbled under the weight of a scientifically calculated assault. The sheer volume of work involved meant that the analysts were essentially building a digital twin of the Normandy coast using analog tools. They had to consider the dynamic loading of a moving tank, which exerts much more pressure than a stationary one. They calculated the Boussinesq stress distribution, mapping how the weight of a vehicle spreads through layers of sand and clay. If the pressure bulb reached a soft layer of peat 3 feet down, the surface would collapse even if it looked solid. This was the invisible danger they mapped with surgical precision. They even accounted for the capillary suction in the damp sand above the waterline, which provided a temporary, deceptive strength that would vanish the moment the tide returned or a heavy vehicle vibrated the ground. The work of the ISTD and COP was so secretive that even the tank commanders often didn't know why they were being ordered to follow specific, narrow paths off the beach. They just knew the maps worked. Behind those maps were thousands of hours of looking through microscopes and calculating wave periods. It was a triumph of indirect observation, proving that with enough data and the right mathematical models, one can see through the earth and the water. The beaches of Normandy were not just a battlefield, they were a proof of concept for a new way of understanding the physical world in the service of a grand strategic goal. The load-bearing capacity of those beaches was the thin line between a successful liberation and a catastrophic defeat, and it was a line drawn with absolute mathematical certainty by men and women who never set foot on the sand until the war was already won. Even the grain shape was analyzed under magnification to determine sphericity and roundness. Angular grains lock together like a jigsaw puzzle, providing a stable platform, while rounded grains act like tiny ball bearings, causing the sand to flow under pressure. The Normandy samples showed a mix, requiring different tactical approaches for each sector. At Sword Beach, the sand was coarser and more angular, allowing for faster armored movement. At parts of Gold Beach, the fine, rounded grains combined with the underlying clay required the immediate deployment of the bobbin tanks. This level of granular detail transformed the invasion from a gamble into an engineered operation. The analysts had mastered the littoral zone, that chaotic space where the land meets the sea, and in doing so, they provided the stable ground upon which the freedom of a continent was built. The legacy of this analytical effort can be seen in the way we now approach environmental disasters and large-scale infrastructure projects. The techniques developed for D-Day, remote sensing, terrain analysis, and clandestine sampling, are the direct ancestors of the satellite imagery and geotechnical surveys used today. But in 1944, there were no satellites. There were only brave men in small boats and brilliant minds in quiet rooms, working together to solve the peat problem and ensure that the tanks of the liberation would not be swallowed by the ancient marshes of France. The history of D-Day is often told through the stories of paratroopers and infantrymen, but the story of the analysts is the story of the ground itself, the silent, weight-bearing foundation of victory. Their work ensured that the longest day would be a day of forward movement, not a day of sinking into the mud of history. The calculations held, the sand supported the weight, and the liberation of Europe began on a foundation of scientific certainty.